And so we came through the Catholic Church in downtown Los Angeles. And I often wondered, how does a kid have this passion for soil and for gardening? And well, my family in Europe had a mill where all the local villages would bring their grains in to have them processed. And they had a small vineyard and an orchard and some animals, and it was a closed system, if you will. Everything went back into the compost pile and the way Mother Nature intended it. And so I guess it was in my blood, so to speak. And of course, if we go, all of our families, if we go back far enough, we're going to find somebody who is in farming, right? Or growing. So I got my love of anything gardening, anything related to, I knew what my career was going to be at the age of 10 because my mom was such an avid gardener. So I'm just going to dive in. Now, this might be a little bit of science for those of you that are watching today. So I'm going to try to make soil a little fun and really give you some of the bones of what makes healthy soil. So I will dive in. If I'm going too fast or if anybody does have any questions, feel free, okay? Okay, a little bit on my background. So I went to Cal Poly in San Luis Obispo. Before I went to college, I started my own business doing interior landscaping for hotels and restaurants down in San Diego. And I worked with a gentleman that developed Seaport Village. And he also had a little garden center there, Seaport Village Gardens, which I ran. And then I sold this little business to go to college. I was 21 and I was the first person in my family to go to college. So I went to Cal Poly. It was all production ag. Everything we learned about was using what I call the hard drugs, the synthetic chemicals. And that was my background. And so for about 25 years now, I've transitioned over to more holistic, organic, ecological gardening, the way that Mother Nature really intended it. And as I go through this program, you're going to see that it really fits in our life right now for us. Did you want to say something, Kathy? No. Okay. I just thought maybe you did. Okay. So you'll see that even now with, this pandemic challenge that we're all in, we realize how we eat and how we care for ourselves is more important than ever. And so the foods that we put into our bodies, we want them to be as nutritional as possible. So, okay, so I was mentioning to Kathy that this is the first question that we always get, and Kathy Kellogg, that's her name as well. And they are distant cousins back to the 1600s, but there's no company affiliation today. With our products, you use water. With theirs, typically you use milk, but there is a little bit of a legacy there. We are in our 4th generation, 95 years, we're celebrating this year. And the family grew up with organic practices. Organic innovation and sustainably sourced materials is our emphasis. We, for the last 3 years, have become a national brand with Home Depot. So we're at almost every Home Depot across the country, with the exception of upstate New York. We're not in that area. And then our oldest facility is in Ontario. We used to do everything where I'm at now, which is our corporate headquarters in Carson. But we moved out to Ontario so that we could be closer to all the manures that are out there. Because that was all the Dutch dairy farmers at one time out in Ontario. So Ontario, Lockford, which is Central California, and then Longview, Washington, which is Southern Washington. And this is the grandfather, Grandpa Kellogg, that started the company. These are some of our old trucks, just to show you we definitely have deep roots, all puns intended. When World War II was over, we had to put people to work. I mean, we've been around for a long time. So we've been through World War II. We've been, before that, the Great Depression, World War II, and all the victory gardens and having to put people back to work, our recession in 2008. And now, again, what happens when there is an economic downturn or a pandemic or a war, our business is considered essential. So I don't know if any of you have experienced this, but there were times that it was hard to find soil amendments anywhere. And I hate to liken it to toilet paper, but it has been an essential because everybody wants to grow their own food, right? We care more about what we're putting in our bodies. It's also food security. The cost of food is going up for, a lot of people don't have access that many of us may have access to. So we like to share our food with our neighbors and maybe with our local food banks. This is our facility in Ontario, just to give you an idea of the scope of a company that's almost 100 years old. And it's still not really big enough, especially for the pandemic right now. This is what it looks like today. And actually, it's even larger than this because we're just trying to catch up and compost our products. You need to have a vast supply of land so that you can actually compost and cook the different materials that you're putting into a soil mix. So I love this slide because it really just shows how far back we go. When so Walt Disney, Walter Knott, and Grandpa Kellogg were all friends and colleagues. And they all three were involved in starting the Farm Bureau in California. And when Walt Disney wanted to build the happiest place on earth, if you think about Southern California, it's sort of a high desert, if you will, very dry environment. And the drier it is, the higher the pH, right? The more alkaline the soil is. Well, they wanted to put in a Jungle Cruise ride and grow tropicals. Now we know we can grow pretty much everything down here, but the soils were not really designed for tropical plants. And so we created the acid planting mix that amended the soils so that these tropical plants would grow well. So I always like to bring this in just to show that, we've been around for a long time. Here are a few other stadiums. I don't know if I have any Dodger fans. I wish I had a Dodger stadium here, but this is the Anaheim Stadium. And this is done with one of our products that maybe you've used, Topper, which I use a lot of on my mom's lawn. We did the historic LA Coliseum. They had a motocross race there, and we had about 3 weeks to get the ball field back. And of course, it's all on a bed of sand, and then we put the organic matter on top. So these things can happen fairly quickly. So what matters? So I'm going to just share a little bit about what's happening out in the industry and what people are asking for. The first one is getting back to normal. I look around, I don't see normal coming in any way, shape, or form of what we used to have. All the incredible restaurants. I live in Southern California, but I can't afford anything here. So I bought 2 states away up in Washington, about 10 miles from our facility up there. So Portland was a place I went all the time because a bunch of foodies are there. I mean, extraordinary restaurants and food and the culture. Well, that, they, as we all can see, they're struggling. And so it's going to be a new normal. Our health, jobs, the economy, soil and plant health is super important. We're starting to pay more attention to the environment, right? And to the planet. We have to. Food security, as we mentioned, water-wise, gardening, protecting bee habitats and our pollinators, right? Because without those little soldiers, we can't really pollinate most of the food that we eat. More time in nature and less screen time. I promise you we'll be done quick. I'm going to go through this fairly quick. Animal welfare, fire safe landscapes, that we actually can create a landscape where there's more of a perimeter. And we start thinking about these things because that's more of our future as well. And then of course, less synthetic chemicals in the garden. A lot of people are working from home. I'm not sure if most of the folks in this group are retired or semi-retired, or maybe you're still working and maybe you've already been working from home, but we see this trend continuing. The companies are saving a lot of money. People are saving on fuel, their time. So we're going to continue to see this along with homeschooling, I think. Exercising more at home. These are some of the new trends, right? Small space gardening. We're seeing a lot of high-rise apartments going up all over the country. And so, balcony gardens are becoming larger. Colorful containers, and the tagline is the thriller, the filler, and the spiller, right? the thriller is the big plant that comes out of the top. The filler is that intermediary plant that kind of bushes out. And then the spiller is what, you know, falls over the side of the container. And then of course, raised beds. So one of the things I didn't share with you is I taught gardening as a form of therapy. When I got to Cal Poly, the dean of the School of Agriculture recommended me for a teaching position. And I worked with people on the last stages of their life. And it absolutely changed me as a human being. And I'm so lucky I still have my mother. She's soon to be 90. And the parallels to our lives, you know, starting out as a seed, if you will, being a little tight, growing into a teenager, into adult, and then coming into the winter of our life. You know, those parallels fit very well with Mother Nature. And so we had raised beds because people were in a wheelchair or they were in a walker. And so we brought the garden to them. Now we do it so that we don't have to deal with our native soil. And of course, I'm 6 feet tall, so I enjoy having it a little bit higher. And raised beds are tremendously huge for people. And it sounds like a few of you have some raised beds as well. Here are some other little things that are happening in the garden. Tiny gardens, outdoor living, nesting, right? Instead of vacations, people are investing at home more and cleaning up their garden space so that they can have a place to recharge and chill out a little bit more. I would be happy in either of those garden environments. And I have to give my friend credit for this. He's in St. Louis, Missouri, and you know, he went from a pandemic, and we are in a plant-demic. People are buying, as you know, succulents have been huge for years now. Euphorbias and cacti. You know, I remember roses when roses were the go-to, and that's even coming back a little bit more. But veggies, herbs, fruit trees, and seeds in the beginning of this season, you couldn't find a seed packet anywhere. And so also house plants. I had an interior landscape company in the 80s. I graduated from high school in 79. I graduated college about 87. I was a perennial student, if you will. And to see this house plant craze back, and the millennials call it plant parenting. So either they had pets when they were kids, or now they're learning how to take care of plants as a way of nurturing things. So these are all things that are happening in the industry today. This is another company that I just want to highlight. They call themselves Farmscapes. And we actually, this is a garden. Oh, I didn't have a picture of our garden. I apologize. Oh, it deleted. So here at our corporate offices, we have wooden raised beds. And this is a company that will come out to your property, assess your site. You can figure out, do you want, I love the water troughs, you know, you just poke holes in the bottom and it's easy. You can buy one. A small one is great. You don't need big ones. Here's some that are wooden. This is at a residence. And then they buy our soils and our fertilizers that we are partners with them, if you will. And then they figure out, what do you like to grow? What do you want to grow? And they maintain it for you. They come in every week, once a week, they plant it, they feed it, they prepare the beds, they put drip irrigation in, and then they harvest it for you. So their motto is stop landscaping and start farmscaping. And it's really and they're booming all across California right now. So just to see what some of the trends are. Okay, so this is about, so what do you mean by holistic, G? What we mean is looking at the whole system. That we look at soil, we look at our garden, we look at our water issues. So if we have water issues, if we know we're in a drought, let's plant some smart plants, right? Plants that actually belong in the landscape, whether they're native, Mediterranean, drought tolerant, Australian types of plants, but smart landscaping. Instead of planting in Burbank, you know, let's say impatiens that require a lot of water, you know, that we're actually planting the right plant for the area that we're in. And looking at the whole system, because clearly we have forgotten about the whole system. when we think about synthetic fertilizers, chemical synthetic fertilizers, and how soluble they are, right? A plant can only use about 10 to 15% of a synthetic chemical soluble fertilizer. You know, the little blue crystals that you put in a watering can, water turns green or turns blue. You know the product I'm thinking of. I don't mention any names, but when it's soluble and a plant tries to take up what it can, most of it is not used by the plant. It actually washes down the soil profile, ends up over the curb in our waterways and as a pollutant. So we want to be wise about some of the materials that we're using. So think of soil as the interface between biology and geology. So you've got geology, you've got the rocks and the mountains, and that's crumbling down into these fine particulates. And how does that all happen? It happens from weathering, it happens from sun, snow, rain, but the real key ingredient is the biology. It's the living organisms that create soil. So if you think of the living organisms, the biology in the soil, the microorganisms, like the digestive tract of the planet, just like we have microflora in our gut that breaks the food down, this is the importance of the biology in the soil. And we are actually, when you cut a forest down, if you don't replant it right away, you lose certain sets of microorganisms in the soil and they don't come back readily. And what does that mean? It means that whatever forest trees you're trying to plant will not come back as strong and as effective. So this biological life that we're talking about is truly some of the most important life on this planet. So we want to create natural defenses in the soil ecosystem, right? We always hear about kids that have pets, or if they grow up on a farm and they play in the dirt with mud pies. I mean, let's bring back the mud pies, because really those children have a much stronger defense mechanism in their bodies. And we know that in our body, about 75 to 80% of our health our immunity comes from our gut. So the microflora in our gut is vitally important to our health. Nutrition, we know, creates resistance and strong immunities. So we want to do the same for ourselves, just like we're doing, oh, here's that picture of our garden. The front garden is new. That's about a month old. And the two gardens behind it, I didn't take a very good picture of this. I wish I had. They've been around. You can see that they're a little bit different color. They've probably been around for about 3 or 4 years. And so this is here at our corporate office. This was just planted. And, you know, it's really a nice stress reliever for people to go out. There's a cat out there and, you know, people can go and have their lunch out there. So, but we really try, you know, to do things for our staff to create a nice space and environment for them. Okay, so soil is the backbone of all of life. And Kathy, if I am rambling on, you know, what's challenging for me, I'll tell you as a speaker, is that there's 19 participants on and I can see one. And normally I can read my audience that way, right? That allows me to know, am I on track with people? Are they still with me? So I'm a little bit animated for a reason, and hopefully it comes through on the computer. So I'm just going to dive in and have faith that we're in this together. So we want to feed the life in the soil. That's the biggest difference between organic practices versus synthetic gardening. The synthetics feed the plant at the expense of the soil, but organics are all about the life in the soil. The life in the soil secretes enzymes to break it down, and then they meter the nutrients up to the plant. So they're like little fertilizer factories, if you will. They're like little fertilizer sacks, releasing nutrients. So there's always a smorgasbord of nutrients for a plant root to garner that food from. Whereas a synthetic is pretty much, the plant takes it up, unless it's something that's a prill, a little fertilizer ball that every time you water, there has to be warmth in the soil. And then, so some are heat sensitive and some are water sensitive and some are both heat and water. So a prill is designed that every time you water, a little bit releases. And so then we might consider it long lasting. But that synthetic product is still force feeding the plant. It's still pushing growth instead of allowing the plant to grow at its natural rate. When you force a plant to grow, you create a plant with a very thin cell wall. In other words, thin leaves, stems, and flowers, literally making the plant soft and not as sturdy as that plant needs to be. And that is what brings in insects and disease pressures much faster than if we grow healthy soil and allow the plant to take what it needs from the soil ecosystem. So they're very different. One is like fast food for your plants in your garden, and one is like a home cooked meal from our grandmother, okay? They're very different systems in how they operate. So that's really what we want to do, is think about our landscape more holistically. So the United Nations Food and Ag Organization reports that at the rate that we've been going, we have about 60 years of harvest left at the current rate of soil loss and degradation. There are a couple of films that I would highly recommend. One of them, if you have Netflix, one of them is called Kiss the Ground. It's been out for the beginning of October, I believe. And it's really an important film to watch. Another one is David Attenborough. I think it's called A Life on This Planet. And it is an absolute eye-opener. And it will move you to tears. That's how important that film is. And I really encourage you to watch it with your kids, your grandkids, nieces and nephews. It's really an important film. And a lot of this soil degradation is our farming practices. We rip and tear and expose the soil, and all that organic matter that's been falling on this planet for eons of time, we've managed to burn it up in about 100 years. And so because we have burned up the organic matter in the soil, that is the food that feeds the life and that makes the system work. So you got to have food, which is organic matter. You got to have biology. If you have those two things, that's what creates healthy soil structure. All these organisms have glues and sticky substances, biofilms on their bodies. And that allows them to glue themselves into the soil, like on the roots, on the organic matter, so that they don't wash out of the soil. A secondary benefit of those sticky substances is it glues the particles of soil together to give you good soil structure. We like to think we're doing it, but we're just helping Mother Nature in that process, okay?
There's a question here.
Yes.
That might be pertinent at this time. One of our members asks, what is your impression of carbon dioxide excess impacting the quality of our vegetables being grown?
Okay, so that's a great question. I'm going to do my best to try to answer it. It's a complex question. So, when a plant is growing on the ground, it's pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, right? It needs that carbon dioxide and processes it with water and through the whole photosynthetic process. So we're taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And then I don't know if a lot of people are aware of this, but Mother Nature's created a system where it's all mutually beneficial. We could learn so much. Here's another metaphor that we could learn so much from nature. Because when a plant takes carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, it produces a food source. It's protein, carbohydrates, and sugars, right? And it leaks it out of the root zone. And that's symbiotic. The plant manufactures food from the sun, and it takes that food and leaks it out of its roots, mostly sugars and carbohydrates. And it does that to feed the life in the soil so that that biology will congregate the root zone and protect it from predators and pathogens. So absolutely what's happening on the planet today is affecting us and how we breathe. Plants are getting, you know, with all the fires that we've had, it's so important to wash the foliage off, get the dust particulates off, get the ash off your plants so that plant can photosynthesize and breathe again. And also, it's if you leave those particulates on I shower my garden. I like to rinse it off at minimum of once a week. I hose it off. That's my first line of defense with keeping insects away or things like spider mites. You have to be intimate with your garden on a weekly basis, especially if it's hot, right? When it gets super hot, one of the first things you need to think about is spider mites, because a lot of people had spider mites this year because it got so hot so quickly and stuff dries out. Another issue, I don't really typically have any issues with disease pressures at all, but spider mites is one thing. Another thing is giant whitefly. I don't know if any of you have had the giant whitefly this year, but the best way to control that is using worm casting. So I'm not sure if I answered your question, but I would say that mulching is very important, keeping a nice layer of mulch, and we'll get to that. Using some liquids. We have some fantastic liquids that are fish, molasses, and seaweed, which I absolutely love, as your immediate feed and a booster. But it's only like a 2-2-2 NPK. So it's not going to force feed anything, but it's going to give the plant the supplements that it needs. So again, I'm not sure if I answered your question, but no question about it that our environment is affecting our plant material that we're growing, and not just ours in the home garden, but our forests and the prairie grasses. Everything is being impacted from it. What is soil? So here's kind of a chart that I'm sure many of you have seen. Typically what we say is soil is a combination of sand, silt, and clay. And in your region, you know, you have a lot of soil that's been brought in to different areas. You have kind of, you know, it's hot and dry in your neck of the woods at times. So you have a typical healthy soil is about 45% sand, silt, or clay, some combination. You have about 25% air, 25% water holding capacity, and up to 5% soil organic matter, okay? The soil organic matter is what makes the system function, right? And that's gonna be the determining factor. So let's just go on to the next one, and I'll go through this. So on the left, you can see that the soil is dark and rich, right? And on the right, it looks sticky and clay-like. And you can see that there's very few roots growing and very few little plant material. So let's look at this next one. So on the left, look at the determining factor there. We've doubled the soil organic matter. You can see that that soil is still rich and dark, and it's a 30% combo of sand, silt, and clay. And now we have more oxygen and more water holding capacity, okay? If we go to the right, look at this, the limiting factor there. Organic matter is about 1%. Now, if you look at 10% oxygen, that system is not going to function properly, and whatever we plant in it is not going to grow well. And we have a lot of soils like this, about 2% organic matter in the soil. And, you know, there's lots of reasons for it. It's, you know, but a lot of it is, you know, we've kind of farmed the life out of our soils. And in the book, Kiss the Ground, there's a book as well called Kiss the Ground. And they talk about how we are seeing a desertification happening in the San Joaquin Valley. Because if you think about it, that San Joaquin Valley was planted at one time, right? And a lot of that's gone now. And now we have vegetable crops there. Well, what happens when the soil lies fallow? When the soil lies fallow, those microorganisms are like, hey, what about us? And when we start losing those populations, it's harder and harder to recharge and revitalize that soil, okay? So now here's another way of looking at this, okay? It's kind of the same picture that you just saw, just with some colorful graphics. Ideal 45% mineral, 25% air, water, and 5% organic matter. Now on the bottom left, I want you to see where it shows that organic matter at 5%, that it says humus. A big portion of it is humus. So it's organic matter in different stages of breaking down. Humus, if you have a giant compost pile and it breaks down, it turns to humus. We also have things like humic acids, which are a more concentrated form of humus, okay? But notice you have 10% roots and you have 10% organisms. So that's in that 5% organic matter. That is what drives the system, okay? Is the biology and the food source that it has. Okay, this is probably a little more science than you were expecting. I'll try to blow through. I have quite a bit of science, so I hope you're all still with me.
They are all still with you.
Okay, very good. If you notice, so this came from a book called Albrecht. He was an extraordinary soil scientist. Now, I'm going to tell you something, folks. I am the last person that ever thought that I would be this enamored by soil, truly. I chose plants as my main, as you know, my passion, but soil and organics chose me into it. But if you look, all of life is built on a bed of soil, right? You have the microbes, which are in the soil. They're the great decomposers and detoxifiers. Then you have the producers, which are plant life. And then you have the predators. And we're one of those predators, okay? So without healthy soil, we can't really sustain ourselves. And we've watched civilizations come and go by how they've cared for soil and their waterways. And we're starting to see that here as well. So dirt is biologically challenged. The nutrients are in a chemical form. There's lots of leaching. The dirt is compacted and hard, severe disease pressures, and increasing dollar inputs. Now, soil is spongy, right? When you step on soil, it springs back. Why? Because the life in the soil has secreted all these biofilms, these glues that literally create a soil that you can suppress, and then it comes back up. It springs back. Dirt does not have that capacity because it doesn't have the food in it and it doesn't have the biology in it. So soil is teeming with life. The nutrients are plant available. There's minimum leaching losses. There's space in the soil for air and water. There's less and less disease pressures. The more organic practices that you use over time, you will have less issues in the garden. And then of course, decreasing dollar inputs. I mean, really soils, I would say that we've probably had our first price increase in over 5 years. And before that, I've been at Kellogg 20 years. When I came to Kellogg, there were products that Kellogg wasn't making any money on because we just didn't want to pass that on to people. But you can't sustain yourself and do that. But if you think about it, soils are still really some of the cheapest things that you can buy at a garden center. And it is still the most important thing you can buy, is to amend your soils properly. So on the left, we show healthy soil structure, right? We have good structure. So remember I was telling you about texture, sand, silt, clay. Sand is gritty. Silt is like talcum powder. Your hand slides right over it. Clay is sticky, okay? So when you have healthy soil, you have good structure, good soil structure. You have water that can move through the soil. The water slows down because there's good soil structure instead of just racing through the soil. The color is dark and rich, and that's from a lot of organic matter. And some of the particles can also be just darker in color. The soil surface is covered with dead vegetation or with growing plants. And on the right, it's the opposite of all of that, right? Poor structure. If you have poor structure, you're not storing water. And the whole ecosystem breaks down. So having that good structure is super important. So I want you to see on the left that healthy soil, the organisms are building that structure. The nutrients are stored in the soil and the water is retained and moves slowly through the soil. And when the water, like let's say rainwater, when it goes through healthy soil, it comes out in the water table as clean. But when you have dirt and you have no structure, the nutrients move, the water moves not only the soil with erosion, but it washes out all the nutrients. And whatever water might make it to the water table is going to be cloudy and murky. So soils are great detoxifiers as well as mineral filters. They're mineral filters and they're biological filters. They're both, but it means you got to have the life in the soil, okay? So again, sand is loose and gritty. You could take a ball of sand, try to make a ball out of it, and it would fall apart, right? So when you have a sandy soil, the goal with the sandy soil is to glue the particulate. Now let's go over to clay. It's sticky and moldable. I could take a clump of clay and make a ball out of it, and it would stick together. So the goal with clay is to wedge the particles apart, to open that soil so that it can breathe better and the water can drain better, okay? I'm just gonna do highlights on some of these. So here's another way of looking at the water, the way the water moves through sand. You can see how it just barrels through the soil, right? Nothing's slowing it down. We need to slow that water down so plants can actually drink from that water. Now silt, you can see that it goes sideways and down, but it doesn't make it all the way down to the root zone like we need it to. So that we wanna wedge that soil open a little bit. So sand, you can see with the naked eye. Silt, you cannot see a particle, or clay without the use of a microscope. They're microscopic particles. And so with clay, notice that the water really stays on the top. And the reason for that is the particulates are so small that when they settle down into the soil, they've taken all that oxygen that we were talking about earlier. They take all that oxygen out of the soil. And now not only can roots not breathe, but the aerobic organisms won't survive. And so there's a reason that we need that oxygen in the soil. So I'm guessing that in your area, of course, you have a combination of the three. I would almost venture to say that it's clay with kind of a rocky, silty kind of a soil. And maybe we can talk about that afterwards. So here's another way of looking at it, right? Sand has the ability to compact is low. The airspace is high. Soil fertility is low. The tendency to form clods is low. Water holding capacity, low. Water and air permeability, high. Workability, high. It's easy to work a sandy soil, but you need more organic matter in a sandy soil, and you need to mulch more often with sand because it goes away faster because there's more oxygen. If you look at clay, the ability to compact is high. The airspace is low. The soil fertility is moderate to high. Now that's a good quality about it. The tendency to form clods is high. Water holding capacity, high. Water and air permeability, low. Workability, low. But clays do have good redeeming qualities. So, you know, we all move to a home or to a piece of property, and we all have to deal with what we have, right? And we have to try to make it work for us. So it can be challenging, no doubt. So you cannot change the texture of your soil, but you can change the structure of your soil. And what that means is how the particles are arranged. Are they glued together or are they, you know, tightly bound, so to speak? We'll talk a little bit more about this. So how do you do it? Organic matter. And that's why when you plant something in the ground, knowing what to use is very important in the soil system. Okay, so we're going to go through a few more. So this is like a science class, but what I want to show is that soils have three fundamental complex structures. You have the physical structure of soil, you have the chemistry, what kind of pH do I have? Is it too high or too low? Because if a pH is too high or too low, that means nutrients get bound by the soil and the plant can't utilize all the nutrients. So we got to balance pH before the system will fire properly. What kind of biology do we have? Do we have beneficial organisms or do we have pathogenic organisms? If we use a lot of blue water, the blue crystals, and you're not mulching much, you probably have a biological system that is in need of being fed a little bit differently. So having the right life in the soil is super important as well. So how do we do that? How do we change all three of these these systems in the soil? We feed it. We feed the system with organic matter. Here's that pH chart. You can see that in the middle, other than iron, well, let's say you're at 6.5. When you look at 6.5, almost everything is still available to the plant. When you get to 7, because the wide band, that's what I'm looking at, the wide band, when it tapers down on the strongly acidic side, if you go to 5, now you can see that almost everything is not available to the plant, with the exception of iron and manganese and boron and copper and zinc. So the trace elements are still available when the pH is really low. And then when you go to the opposite end of the spectrum, because we're in a dry area, when it's dry, the pH is high, it's alkaline. When it's really wet, the pH is super low, it gets more acidic, like in the Northwest, right? So people grow blueberries, azaleas, rhodies, dogwoods. They need that acid pH. But when it drops too low, nothing is available to the plant. So this is the chemical side of it. I showed you the physical part of it. Now I'm showing you in this one slide the chemical part of it. And now I'm going to show you some of the life. Okay. But all of these systems work together. Now notice it says acidic conditions favor bacteria, neutral to alkaline conditions favor fungal activity. But we need both in our soil system. Okay, a little bit about microbes. Boy, I did not know I was going to get a science class today. Microbes rule the world. We like to think we do, but these tiny little organisms do. A microbiome is a community of organisms. We also have a microbiome on our skin, in our gut, in our mouth, in our nose, in our throats. And it all depends on our DNA, what kind of food we eat, the kind of stress that we're under. We all have different microbiomes in our own system, just like soil does. So with a healthy microbiome, you're going to have healthy plants, animals, people, and a healthy planet. Now notice on the left, typically the food or the fertilizer, the fertilizer that we're adding is on the outside of the root wall, just like the microbes are, right? The microbes are taking that organic matter that we put into the soil and they're breaking it down and they're feeding the plant with it. And if you notice in our gut, we assimilate the food and digestion starts here. If we chew our food smaller, the smaller it is, the easier it is for our gut to digest it. The easier it is for the microflora in our gut to break it down further. Now let's just think about a compost pile for a minute. The smaller the particle, when you put it in a compost pile, the faster it breaks down. The larger the particle size, like a giant branch, if we don't chip that and put that in a compost pile in a smaller way, it takes forever for it to break down. So in a weird way, we have a similar thing happening in our guts as is happening in the soil. Mother Nature has a way of figuring all this out. And I think we could learn a lot more from her. So humans are affected by the environment and by food, and so is soil. Also affected by food and chemicals, right? Antibiotics is to diminish life. We know if we take an antibiotic, we hope it's going to kill whatever makes us sick. And this is not to say Western medicine is so important. A combination of the two is even better. We take an antibiotic, it also strips us of a lot of our microflora. And, then we can become constipated. Now, when you're a professional poop saleswoman like I am, you have no problem talking about what comes in has to come out. The gross factor is long gone for me. The system has to work, right? And anybody that's taken an antibiotic knows what I'm talking about. And then you have to eat yogurt or kefir or kimchi or some kind of biologically active food, right? Probiotics are to encourage life, right? We want to have a healthy immune system so that and that's how we do it, by feeding ourselves and feeding our gut. So this is a very important economy. It's one of the most important economies on the planet. I know we like to think that ours is, but without this economy intact, ours won't serve us either. And so that's where we need to start thinking. I can tell that I'm already talking way too long. So let me kind of barrel through a few of these. Okay, so soil organisms, you all know that penicillin came from soil, right? The organisms maintain the structure. There's gas exchanges happening. They suppress pests. They make decomposition possible. They detoxify soil, and they're responsible for plant growth. So here's mycorrhizal fungi. So we add beneficial bacteria and mycorrhizal fungi into our soils. The root of the word, mycor means fungus and rhiza means root. And the root zone is really the single most important area for plant growth and development. That root zone is what you do at the root zone determines what's going to happen above. What you don't do at the root zone is also going to show up above. So caring for the soil before we plant is really true success in gardening. It's not after the fact. You got to do it as you're planting. So these roots, what looks like roots on the right, so that on the left, you'll see that's the root structure, okay? On the right, you'll see the fungus that's attached to the root, and that protects the root and increases the surface area of that root zone. And now that plant has more access to water and nutrients, okay? It's one of Mother Nature's protectors, okay? And you can see on the left, non-mycorrhizal. So a root system has to work much harder and is exposed to many more pathogens when it doesn't have the fungi and the beneficial bacteria glued to it. There's no place for a pathogen to get in and infect a root in a biological system. That's really what we're looking at. They call this the original World Wide Web. And the largest living organism on the planet is a colony of mycorrhizal fungi in Eastern Oregon. So you can see how they protect each other. They hold hands in the soil. They send out chemical compounds to block pathogens from coming into their community, so to speak. We're learning so much more about the life in the soil. So these are pine seedlings, and you can see instead of just a single root coming down, they have a community that they can pull from, okay? Okay, so I'm gonna go through some of these fairly quickly so I can give you some idea with the product. So the big exchange, remember I was talking about from that question earlier about the carbon dioxide. When a plant is thriving, it's taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and it leaks or exudes liquid food out of its root zone to feed the living organisms in the soil. It's by design that Mother Nature shares the food that she makes with the living organisms in the soil. So this is what we mean by the big exchange. All the white that you see, that's the food, the photosynthate coming down to feed the life in the soil. And the green is the plant taking up water and minerals. That's the great exchange that's always happening in the soil. So the exudates, that's what the plant is secreting. It's an exudate. And it's protein, carbohydrates, and sugars, okay? And that's typically, so that's what the roots give out. Glomalin or glomalin is what is the sticky substance on the fungi. So all these different life organisms in the soil, you know, life is moisture, right? Life is creating, having this ability to retain moisture and hold on to a particle of soil to create a semi-stable soil aggregate. So that's the carbon glues the soil particles together. The glues, and all the things that these organisms. So you can see in this bottom right-hand corner how the soil particles are glued together. And then you have those fungal threads that wrap around it. This is what we're talking about when we want to have healthy soil. That's what it looks like. Earthworms are the greatest rototillers on the planet. There's a lovely little book by Amy Stewart called The Earth Moved. And I know I need a life. My mom's like, can't you read a romance novel once in a while, honey? I'm like, there's lots of romance going on in horticulture. But notice that the earthworm does its business on top of the soil. They're tidy. They don't want to make a mess. And that's their castings. And so they mix and aggregate soil. They create these tunnels for oxygen, and they're great little fertilizer factories. Okay, I'm going to go to some product now. A little bit on the over-reliance on synthetic nitrogen fertilizers. It triggers soft growth. Plant food, really, a fertilizer is the proper word. Plant food is a synthetic, typically. It's far more important to build up the soil organic matter. You get less forcing of growth, less insect and disease pressures. We're certified organic. All of our products are certified organic. OMRI, we're OMRI approved or OMRI listed on the left. On the right, CDFA is California Department of Food and Ag. And this is what they test for. 100% organic ingredients, the manufacturing process, the nutrients, heavy metals, sulfur, bacteria, fungi, and humates. On the right, you can see what is not allowed are synthetics, contamination, radiation, genetically modified organisms, or biosolids. That is not allowed in an organic system. And the laws changed in the early 90s, and it took a decade for the people that were in the ag department to come up with these guidelines. They fought at the table to figure out how to create these guidelines so that we know that we're providing safe products for people. So here's some of the nutrients that we use, like Mother Nature, right? Chicken manure, worm castings, bat guano, kelp meal. So some are, like 3 of those are basically manures, and 1 is plant, right? Kelp meal is considered. Of course, you all know what the benefits. So we use a lot of dried poultry waste. It's fast acting. We eat a lot of chickens in this country, unless you're a vegetarian, forgive me, or a vegan. We use bat guano, fast acting. Little bit goes a long way. So we have that for quick green up. Seaweed, I love seaweed. If you haven't been using seaweed or kelp in your, so kelp meal is a granulated form. Seaweed extract is the liquid extract from the seaweed. I look at seaweed and kelp as it has hormones in it. So it helps the plant with elongation and cell division. So strong roots, thick stems, brilliant flowering, disease resistance, strong immunities when you have seaweed. And that's why we use it. We use some minerals, right? Just to show you, we use some gypsum, we use some rock phosphate. Those are mined minerals. So we will use manure, plant-based, minerals, and then we add bacteria and we add fungi into our. So when I was in college, I know my time is almost up. My professor would say, it should be the big 4. We have the big 3, right? NPK, right? Nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. That's used in the largest quantity. He felt that it should be the big 4, and calcium should be considered. But it's a secondary nutrient. But calcium is so important for plant growth and development and thicker. If you've ever grown tomatoes and you get the blossom end rot, that is the cell wall of that tomato collapsing and turning black because there's not enough calcium to give it strong bone structure, so to speak. Okay, plants need that too, just like we do. And now I'm going to just show you some products. So here's the humic acid. let me show you a few of the products. Okay,
Gisele,
yes.
As you start that, let me say that we have one more question at the end. We'd like to have your email if you don't mind members writing to ask you questions. And you really have another 10 to 15 minutes to go through this. So please don't worry about it. We're not going anywhere.
Okay, perfect. And my email address is at the very end. So absolutely. So let me back up then a couple here. So mulching. This is my side yard up in a little town called Castle Rock. It's a podunk little town. But what's so cool is my neighbor owned a nursery for about 30 years. And then she sold it. And then she had the coolest job. She did all the growth trials for like ball seed and proven winner, all the new growth trials. She would grow them in her greenhouse, grow them in the garden. And then people would come out and they would tell her, well, I like this rose. I like this plant because it's got great color. It's less disease pressures. It's a hardy plant. And she would grow and then tell all the big growers what were the favorites and what were the healthiest plants in her market. So we now, if you look at the town of Castle Rock in Washington, we have won this award called America in Bloom. And you know, when you go to, like, if you've ever been to British Columbia, Vancouver, and they were one of the first places I remember doing this. They had those giant big baskets that hung down. For the size of our town, which is about 3,000 people, we have won that award about 4 years in a row. And she has all the grade school, middle school, high school, and every business in town is involved in it. So it's really, really, really cool. So this tree on the right is about 5 times that size now. And this is how I mulch my trees, right? I put a little berm around them, not a volcano. I'm not covering the trunk. I'm leaving an area so that I can water in there. So mulching is what we call top-down gardening, right? Once you've put all your amendments in the soil, you can't really go back and amend that anymore for a traditional landscape. Now with your vegetable garden, you can every year. But mulching is top-down gardening. It's creating a forest floor around your plant. And that's really important to do every year. It keeps moisture at the root zone. It minimizes it from evaporating when it gets hot. Keeps the roots protected. It also works like a shock absorber. If you have mulch on your soil and we get a heavy downpour, if you have bare soil, when that rain hits that soil, it hits it with such force that soil starts to erode and you lose a lot of your soil. So it slows the impact of water. So the water goes through the mulch and then works its way down into the soil. Because if you don't cover your soil and you get a big downpour, you will ruin that soil structure because the force of the water pushes that and fills up all the air spaces in the soil. So mulching is super important. Just to see that zone, the influence of residue, protects that soil, provides habitat, and it helps build good soil structure. It's like the icing on the cake, or the top hat, if you will. Now, if you notice on the right, you can see where I put my amendment down first, and then I cover it with all the tree, all the mulch, the thicker mulch. It's sort of like a lasagna effect, if you will. And I'm a fertilizer fairy at my place. I fertilize, I'm not up there all the time, but when I'm up there, I'm out there fertilizing. And really for me, honestly, it's what flavor do I have? What blend am I going to create for my garden? So when you see, if you've ever opened up a bag of our product and you see white or gray fungal filaments, or sometimes they could be yellow or a little orange cast, that is a beneficial. It looks like a mold, but it's a beneficial there breaking the wood down. So when you see it in there, just fluff it into the bag, it'll disappear, and it's part of a natural cycle in the soil, okay? So on the left, that volcano type, and then on the right is a berm. Okay, that's typically what I do for my trees. This is my front yard many years ago, much bigger yard than I ever wanted, especially lawn. And moss is a huge issue in the Northwest because it rains a lot, right? And the soil's acid, it's tightly bound clay. And if you don't feed and you don't aerate once in a while, the soil gets so tight and so dense that moss just takes over. So moss, I'm trying to figure out the right word. It's almost predatory. Like if you don't take care of the lawn and feed it, the moss is what you're going to get. But if you feed your lawn and take care of your lawn, the moss is more secondary. So here I was getting rid of thatch and moss. I had truckloads of it. So you can see now that's mostly moss. And this is what it looked like when I was done. It doesn't look that good now. I need to redo it again, but it lasted about 4 or 5 years. But it's a big project to do a lawn and, aerate it. That's a huge machine. Thatching, that's a big project. But this was all done organically. Not one synthetic was used in this process. So here's some of our products. This is the Gardener and Bloom line. Now, let me tell you just before I forget. So Sago Nursery, Green Thumb Canoga Park, Vineland Nursery, Moon Valley in North Hollywood, they would carry, only an independent garden center can purchase these products. The Kellogg brand is at both channels of trade, the big box stores and also at the mom and pops. But Kellogg bought this line in the 90s, the late 90s. I always say to kind of make up for their sins for going into Home Depot, because the Kellogg, it's always the mom and pop that builds a brand, right? And then when you grow as a company, you have to go to these other places. We've been in Home Depot now for about 35 years, and we're now national across the country with them. And that is no easy undertaking. I am just blown away by our people and our staff and the commitment of the Kellogg family and Home Depot working with us. So they bought this brand so that they would have an exclusive brand for the independent customer, the independent garden center. So Kellogg actually has a soul and really cares about our whole industry as a whole. We're really a cornerstone of the industry. We've been around that long. So you can see we have things from native topsoil, Harvest Supreme, Farmyard Blend, chicken fertilizer, worm castings, compost, the raised bed. Now I'm going to tell you how I do things. Okay, so we'll go through a few of these. Here's some other ingredients that we use. If you've, Noella, it might have been you asking that question about the carbon dioxide and how it affects our garden.
That was Robin.
Okay, Robin. I think it was Noella mentioning that she's planting roses and she was going to use Amend.
That's right.
Yeah, this is one of the ingredients that you'll find in Amend. If you've ever used Amend in a clay soil, rice holes are there to wedge the clay apart. It helps create structure in the soil. Do you know that pre-1970s, you see that teepee burner on the bottom? A lumber mill would mill the wood and take all the bark and all the ash and all the remnants, and they burned it. So here we were putting carbon, right? Something that was once living. We burn it and put the ash into the air instead of the food that it is and putting it into the soil to feed the life and make the system work. See, we're learning. It's taken us some time, but these are practices that we've done that were kind of unconscious at the time. And now we're hopefully waking up to a lot of different things, right?
Can I ask a question about that,
Of course.
Gisele?
Yes.
I do remember seeing those whenever we would drive north. The further north you got, the more of those little burning things we would see. With the knowledge that we're finally admitting to here about how soils work, have they stopped doing that? Are those becoming just antiques that nobody uses anymore? Those little...
Yes, they are. I mean, so in the 1970s is when we had the Clean Air and Water Act, and that was no longer allowed. Now, people do still burn, right? You have to call the ag department or the fire district and find out, is it a burn day? Has to be all the right conditions for us to be able to burn. And what's interesting is up in the Northwest in Washington, they like to burn anytime they cut trees down. They keep the lumber, the good stuff. They keep the wood to put in the fireplace, but I like to chip it and put it down as mulch, whereas they want to burn it. And they're like, oh, you must be from California. Because the reason I want to put it on the soil is because I want to minimize my weeds from coming up. So I have a different function and a different focus. But yes, they are, Kathy. They're stopping that. Now they're doing different kinds of burning. Like now we're seeing more biochar, wood being burned down to ash, not completely down to ash, but into charcoal, so to speak. And we're now using that as an amendment. Because we have all these agricultural waste byproducts. I mean, they're not really waste, they're food, they're byproducts that some other organism can eat. So I'm just going to go through the soils fairly quickly, just to give you an idea, because now you're going to see, you'll see us everywhere. You know, and we have different products at different, so Kellogg and Gardner and Bloom both have a solution for anything you're planting, okay? So this product's been around for probably 35, maybe 40 years. This is kind of our all-purpose potting soil. Now notice it does even have a little bit of rice hulls in it as well to give it a little structure in the soil, even though it's a potting mix. So this is more wood, peat, perlite based mix, okay? The next one I'm gonna show you, hopefully it's the next one, is the Blue Ribbon Blend. And this is peat moss. Notice, okay, I'm gonna go back. The first ingredient on this one is recycled forest products, okay? Think of that as a coarser mix. Right off the bat, if you look at what the first ingredient is, that's what you're gonna see the most of. Now, if you are a specialty grower, and I don't mean that crop, but if you like to grow special things in the garden, although they do use this, all those underground tomato growers, they buy this by the truckload. We didn't design it for that. But this is more like a specialty mix. It's going to hold a little bit more moisture. It's got peat moss. So this is peat, wood, and coconut coir. So more moisture holding. And then we also add the beneficial mycorrhizal fungi to this, okay? So this is my go-to because I want to have something that's going to retain the moisture a little bit better. I could almost start seeds in this one, but you couldn't in the other one, depending on the size of the seed. So this is another mix that we have for Blue Ribbon Blend, our raised bed potting mix. Now we have this on the Kellogg side and on the Gardner and Bloom side. Now I'm going to tell you a little secret on how I do things. So we say, and this is, the product's ready to use. You can take it out of the bag, no mixing required. But I will tell you that I'm a blender and I want to supercharge my soil, especially if they're vegetables. So I'm going to mix it up a little bit. I'm going to use this as the base to fill my raised bed, but I'm going to leave about 3 or 4 inches over the top. And that's where I'm going to put in my magic potion. I'm going to add maybe a farmyard blend, or I'm going to add a chicken manure, or I'm going to add some worm castings in the planting hole. And I'm going to add my fertilizer in the planting hole. See, it's like you really want to make it supercharged before you plant, okay? So raised bed, look at raised bed as your base. And then let me show you some of the things that I would add. Oops, I didn't have them in the right order, sorry. So here's farmyard blend. This is our plethora of poop. So you have to look at us like, okay, we make potting soils and potting mixes, right? So a raised bed potting mix is just a large container, right? It has perlite in it. Perlite or pumice, that's the other thing the Blue Ribbon Blend has is pumice versus perlite in the red bag. And I prefer pumice because it holds the pore space better. It doesn't crush, it doesn't float to the top. So those are the 2 determining factors of a potting mix, because in a container, it has to drain. Then you have a planting mix, right? That's typical, or a garden soil. That's for in-ground, okay? Then you have manures. Manures help supercharge things, right? And with a manure, you're not going to use as much as you would a planting mix. Like a planting mix, you'd use like 2 inches to 3 inches on top of the soil and mix it into the soil. If you're using a manure, about 1 inch is plenty because it's more concentrated, right? So you want to think about that when you're gardening, is adding some other ingredients to add more nutrient charge. So
I have a question. I have a
Yes.
question for you, Gisele,
yes.
and also a time check. We're at 11:15 now. So,
Okay.
but the question is regarding peat. Peat is a limited resource, and the question is, would you recommend using more coir as a sustainable alternative to
A
peat?
very good question. So we started working with coconut coir. Like I said, I've been here 20 years. I'm going to say 15 years ago. And what we found is, while yes, it's more sustainable, you don't have to cut the coconut tree down in order to get it. It's cheaper than a full truckload. A container of coir, although it's expensive, is cheaper than peat moss by a truckload. But where it's difficult is they put them in these blocks. It takes 450 gallons of water to break up 1 pallet of blocks. So when you're in operations, it has to make sense. More water, more labor, it's more challenging. And we as a manufacturer that have been around for almost 100 years, it has to make sense. So we did incorporate it. The 2 products that we carry that have the coconut coir is that blue ribbon blend potting soil and the raised bed potting mix. So let me just go back real quick and just show you products so that you know what we have. So there's raised bed. Remember to mix in some other good stuff. Always add your fertilizer. Acid planting mix for anything acid loving. And you can, with our planting mix, you can use it to amend the soil to plant in the ground. But you can also plant directly into this. So if I bought a bunch of rhodies or azaleas, probably don't do great up in your area, but you'd want to supplement the soil for in the ground. You can also plant your Japanese maples, your other acid-loving plants directly into this, and it's just perfect. So we have 3 planting mixes. There's another one for trees and shrubs. And then the third one is rose and flower planting mix. All of those are amendments for in the ground. There also can be used for a container mix. And then there's this is one of my favorites, palm, cactus, and citrus planting mix, in ground or in pots, no problem. Here's manure. Here's another manure. Harvest Supreme. This is a pre-fertilized amendment with a bunch of manures in it. Okay, so this is like supercharged. You could even take a bag of this and lay it over the top of your raised bed potting mix and mix it in and get it supercharged. So when you look at product, I want you to think about what it is. If it tells you it's a potting mix, you know it's for in a container. If it's a planting mix with us, it's in ground or a pot. If you see Harvest Supreme and you see amendment, it means you're not planting directly into this. You're using this to amend your soil. I mean, unless it's a tomato, okay? Last one, soil building conditioner, that's for clay, and that's also great for mulching. I love this product. If you haven't used it yet, start getting into worm castings, topsoil if you have low spots. Here's our fertilizers. We have everything you can need in a fertilizer mix, including lawn. This is the liquid I was telling you about, fish, molasses, and seaweed. Awesome product, immediate feed. Remember, the granules are the insurance policy. They take a couple weeks before they're available to the plant. But as the plant gets established, then they have that food. And then I just want to show you the Kellogg family of products. And here's my website. Those are, you'll see us everywhere. We have fertilizers. The best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is today. And then there's my email address, g@kellogggarden.com. And there's 3 G's in the middle. And yeah, I'm really grateful. This is the first Zoom garden club that I've done. And so I hope that this was effective and interesting. And if anybody has any feedback, the good, the bad, the ugly, was it too much science? Was it something new for you? I'm open to any feedback because this is going to be my new format for the garden clubs. So
Well,
thank you very much.
That is really just great. We appreciate you so much today. I thank you for coming. Leave your card up for a bit. I'm going to start unmuting people to see if they have anything to say. We're going to go into our garden club meeting in a few minutes, but I wanted to tell our members while you're still here that you have kindly offered to send us some sample products. And we had about 21 people here today. So if that's a guide for you, we don't need to send it to everybody. We're going to have a drawing at the end of our next meeting and send out some of your products when they're available to us. I think everybody
Absolutely. I'll get something out tomorrow.
Oh, I thank you, Gisele. This was terrific. You feel it was a little science heavy, but it's important to know that stuff, isn't it?
It really is. Yeah, I think, you know, I'm not a soil scientist, but I will tell you that when I transitioned to organics, everything, all my soil and fertilizer classes made sense to me.
Yeah, yeah.
So.
And in the end, it is, if we take care of that soil, it actually is less costly to us.
It is, yes. Yeah.
Well,
my addiction, gardening.
All right.
Yeah.
I have asked our board members who are here today to go ahead and unmute and turn on their videos. So, but if you need to get going, you can go. We're going to just move right into the next part of our meeting. We thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you too.
Today.
Thanks everybody. Have a wonderful day. Appreciate it. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Gisele.
You're so welcome. It was my pleasure.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Have a wonderful day. Stay safe, everybody.
And Gisele, we recorded this meeting, so we'll send you the link.
That would be great. Thank you.
Okay, bye.
Kathy, real quickly, it says you cannot start your video